It's been a while since I've talked about Stable Diffusion. In my last video, I explained Stable Diffusion models once and for all, and I think it's about time I made a follow-up. However, this is not quite the follow-on video that I expected to make over a year later. In a sense, it does seem like I explained things once and for all, because there have been no major model updates since then. And what I mean by major model update, there is no Stable Diffusion 4, there is no Flux 2, there have been no major open source competitors for static image generation, and I think a lot of that has to do with the collective attention shift towards video. Now, don't worry, I will explain a couple of updates like Chroma and Stable Diffusion 3.5, and of course there are other non-open source models like Grok, but allow me to first explain my take on this. You see, I'm starting to notice a pattern with this open source AI stuff, and it's that the collective attention seems to shift away from the thing just before we get something truly satisfying. I already saw this happen with voice. If you've listened to any of my videos before, you probably recognize that I'm still using the same old voice technology from a couple years ago. And it's not because I want to. I've actually been looking for a new voice for quite some time, and I've stopped making videos because I don't really like the voice that I'm using. It sounds outdated. But it seems that once we were on the cusp of getting high-fidelity speech-to-speech models, attention kind of shifted away from that, kind of split off into text-to-speech and image generation, stuff like that. And I saw the same thing happen for image generation about a year ago. Video models started to become good around that time, and so I think a lot of the collective attention started to shift towards that rather than sticking with static image generation. So with all that said, let me fill in the gaps since my video came out over a year ago. Now, at that time, Stable Diffusion 3 was brand new. Flux had just came out, and the verdict was still out for who was going to win in the static image generation space. Stable Diffusion came out with Stable Diffusion 3.5, which was a modest update on 3, generally better quality and stuff like that, but it never really got widespread adoption. So I think you can say that Flux won the battle between the two of them. If you look at maybe Civet AI for an example of which model has more collective attention towards it. But what took me by surprise was that Stable Diffusion XL, still to this day, seems to be more widely used. And of course, I don't mean SDXL 1.0 that came out 2 years ago. I mean, there are still new fine-tunes for XL that are coming out on a regular basis. Probably the most notable strain today, at least in terms of anime styles, is Illustrious. And considering the technical limitations that come with the XL model that it's built on, it's quite impressive what it can do, and arguably, at least for anime styles, still outperforms Flux and its derivatives. And that leads me to the problem with Flux, or rather the multiple problems with Flux. First of all, the license situation for Flux is a little bit weird. It's quasi-open. There's a version of Flux that is free to fine-tune, and then there is a version of Flux that is free to use, but not free to modify. So a lot of that kind of hampers the effort for fine-tuning Flux models, in my opinion. Another big factor of why Flux doesn't get a lot of attention is just because it is more heavyweight and harder to use, and certainly harder to fine-tune than Stable Diffusion XL. For end users, Stable Diffusion XL is viable for people with as little as 6 gigabytes of VRAM. And while CPU inference is always a thing, It's impractically slow to generate anything with Flux, and anything less than maybe 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Of course, there are GGUF quantizations of Flux that work with smaller amounts of VRAM. Of course, people use these. They're a little bit lower quality than the full model. But of course, that's for more advanced users who know what they're doing. I think a lot of the reason why XL is still used is just the accessibility factor. And of course, on the training side, fine-tuning Flux does require a lot more resources than XL, so you're going to get less people attempting to fine-tune it. The most widely used Flux fine-tune today is Chroma. It's a very viable model. It's fully uncensored. It's been trained on a variety of styles, where the original Flux is very heavily focused towards realistic images. So I think if you wanted to dive into the current state-of-the-art with static image generation, you want to start with Chroma. But like I said, it's not for everybody. You're going to have to get used to using Comfy UI for one, and you're going to have to start getting used to GGUF quantizations. You're going to have to learn how all that stuff works. But like I said before, the Flux model that is at its base is over a year-old technology at this point. There have been no new major breakthroughs in a year for static image generation, at least when it comes to open source stuff. So the takeaway here is that if you haven't paid attention to image generation in a while, well, you haven't missed much. And Stable Diffusion XL remains relevant today despite its technical limitations, probably because it hits that sweet spot for being good enough for what it is versus its usability and the amount of resources it takes to train new fine-tunes. So don't hold your breath for a new major breakthrough in image generation. It will happen, but it's just happening a lot slower than it was a year or two ago when new models were coming out every 6 months. But that's going to do it for this video. I know a lot of people have been asking for a new rundown on Flux and all the new state-of-the-art models, but honestly, there has just not been a lot of activity. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty on setting up Comfy UI nodes and stuff like that. At the high level, there just hasn't been any major news on the image generation front, pretty much because video has taken over everybody's attention. So I hope you enjoyed this brief update/informal rant. I don't really know what this is. Anyway, thank you for watching and have a nice day.